Good evening, everybody. I'm Peter Cowhey, and I have the pleasure and honor of serving as the Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy here at the University of California, San Diego. Tonight, we're at one of the opening events of a year of celebration at the school. It's our 30th anniversary. And as we think about those 30 years, there are some things to be said about the school, past, present, and future. I think that the most important thing to be said, it's been a school that has been fearless about experimenting at the edge of understanding the role of an institution of research and higher education in exploring what training and what research skills needed to be developed to train the generations of leadership of the next century. We began with a bet at this school. The bet was that in the 21st century, the Pacific, which we define simply as the Americas and Asia, would become the new fulcrum point of global dynamics, in a sense displacing the leadership of the Atlantic region of past centuries. And for doing that, we both focused our training geographically for all of our students, but we also believed that there was a new model that was necessary for thinking about the dynamics of leadership and careers in the emerging 21st century. So our curriculum was really the first of the major international affairs schools to embrace the idea that the core curriculum should train people in much of the core of what you would think of as traditional international relations and economics, plus the skills of management, so that people could move in careers from the public to the nonprofit to the private or any other mix and match in their careers, and have, as our alumni like to call it, a toolkit that fit all occasions. The other big bet of the school was that an emphasis on empirical analysis driven by advanced quantitative skills plus qualitative case studies were going to be vital as the tools for understanding a rapidly changing landscape in the emerging 21st century. And those bets about our curriculum, about the type of faculty that we hired, and about our aspirations for our students have informed the evolution of the school over time. Change, of course, is a perennial in any institution living in a dynamic environment. Some of the changes that have occurred most recently are the introduction of a Master's of Public Policy program to complement our international affairs degrees, because many of our students found themselves in positions of leadership in regional and local governments because those regions were beginning to think globally and looking to best practices around the world to inform their own choices about strategy and policy. In addition, the school sits at one of the great centers of science and technology in the world. The research and development budget of UCSD is substantially larger than $1 billion a year. That makes us, depending on your count rankings, either the fourth or the fifth largest research university in the United States. In a place that is a center of science and technology innovation, it made sense for the school to embrace a mission of intense interdisciplinarity, bringing on to the faculty people with PhDs in the natural sciences who still publish in their core scientific disciplines, but at the same time also are trained for and publish in the leading social scientific policy journals in the world. Those changes represent the fact that many of the forces that are further transforming our world are really being driven by an accelerating pace of scientific and technological innovation and its disruption of all corners of 21st century society. As we look forward to the future, we've chosen that this 30th anniversary year will also be a moment of reflection about what we've done in the past and what we should do next in the future. And so, as you join us in events throughout the year, you'll see three persistent themes. The first is about the future of democracy and authoritarianism. The second is about the intersection of science and technology and public policy. And the third is about refashioning or reinventing the rules to order global and local society. And so tonight, we turn to an event that represents a building block to that understanding on several fronts, looking at the intersection between public opinion and foreign policy in the United States. This intersection, I believe, has been crucial to the success of the United States leadership in the world after 1945. And of course, we're at a moment today where many of our assumptions about the political consensus underlying our foreign policy, whether it be in security or economics or in matters of our views about human rights and democracy, are contested at a level that we haven't seen since roughly 1946 to 1948. So it's important for us to understand where the American people are today, where the signs are of change, and where the signs of continuity are. And we have a panel that will help us explore both opinion and its consequences for policymaking. Our lead speaker tonight, and we are going to have three of them, each doing a short presentation, and then after that I'll ask a question or two, and then we'll open it up to all of you for questions from the audience, is Jocelyn Kiley. Jocelyn is the Associate Director at the Pew Research Center. Pew has established itself as perhaps the best and most acute center for public opinion polling in the United States, both about domestic and global attitudes. Jocelyn leads the project at Pew on political polarization and also the analysis of outcomes of U.S. domestic elections. She'll talk tonight about the effects of public opinion, or I should say the changing views of public opinion on foreign policy as reflected in their latest polling. She joined Pew in 2008 after an education at Harvard and unfortunately at Berkeley. But in her next life, she'll return here. She will be followed by one of our own at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, Lauren Prather, who's an assistant professor of international relations. Lauren got her PhD from Stanford in 2015. Her work focuses on political behavior and public opinion and their consequences for foreign policy, but also on the area of democracy promotion and democratization. And she has a book that will be forthcoming in the not too distant future on how foreign electoral interventions, let's say by the United States, has effects on local trust in elections. As we try to promote democracy in elections, do we actually build confidence or do we undermine confidence in local elections? Her research is supported by institutions like the National Science Foundation and the MIT Election Lab. Our final speaker, bringing to bear an enormous degree of experience in the world of foreign policy making, but also in the intersection of law and foreign policy, is John Bellinger. He's a partner in the public international law and national security law practices of Arnold and Porter in Washington, D.C., one of the country's preeminent law firms. He's also the adjunct senior fellow in international and national security law at the Council on Foreign Relations. In his distinguished career, John has served as the legal advisor for the U.S. State Department, and he also was the person in charge of Condi Rice's confirmation process as Secretary of State. He served prior to this period with Secretary Rice from 2005 to 2009 as a member of the National Security Council staff, and he was in the Situation Room on 9/11 as a result. He's a member of the Secretary of State's Advisory Committee on International Law and one of the 4 U.S. members of the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. John has a reputation as a person who is a lawyer's lawyer with the integrity of thinking about how the law influences and has to shape our choices about foreign policy and deep experience in navigating those often difficult waters. So we have 3 terrific panelists tonight. We're going to go through them in order, and then at the end we'll turn to questions. And so with that, let me turn to Jocelyn. Thanks for being with us today.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about American attitudes over time when it comes to foreign policy. And just to give a little bit of a preview, that in many ways, American attitudes overall have remained fairly stable, or seem to have remained fairly stable over the course of the last several decades. But I'll take these next couple of minutes to show and highlight a dynamic that I think won't be unfamiliar to you, and that is that a lot of attitudes around foreign policy have gotten pulled into something that we see in attitudes about domestic politics as well, and that is political polarization, rising differences between Republicans and Democrats. And we can talk about some of the implications of those differences in terms of policy, how policy is made, but we do definitely see it in terms of public opinion. So I'll start with one core trend that we at the Pew Research Center have been tracking for more than a decade, and this is simply about whether the US should be active in world affairs or should focus on problems here at home. And I think one thing that this overall, when we look at this trend, you can see that Americans tend to tilt more towards saying concentrate on problems here at home. And in fact, when you ask Americans whether they think the president, regardless of who the president is, the president at the time should focus more on domestic politics or on domestic policy or foreign policy, for the most part over the last 20 years or so, by ratios of close to 2 to 1, Americans have said domestic policy. And it's really only in times of crisis or where there's a lot of attention to something happening on the world stage where you even see Americans sort of at parity. So in the last time we saw equal shares saying foreign policy and domestic policy on that question was back in 2007. There's a lot of attention on the Iraq War. And as recently as last year, we saw something like 61% of Americans saying the focus should be on domestic policy. So you can see here that over time, Americans tend to say concentrate more on problems here at home rather than be active in world affairs. But you do see this uptick between 2014 and 2017, which I think to some people is a little surprising, given the shift in administration, that there's been a sense that the Trump administration would move away from activism. And I think, in fact, that's sort of what you see here, that movement in the share saying that the US should be active in world affairs between 2014 and 2017 is coming entirely from Democrats. That Democrats, I think it's fair to say, are seeing the policies of the current administration and wanting to see the U.S. go back to a level of activism rather than withdraw from the world stage. We can see here on these attitudes about working with allies, again, a remarkable amount of stability overall. Again, back to 2004, we asked the question of whether the U.S. should take into account the interests of allies, even if it means making compromises, or if the U.S. essentially should go it alone when they disagree with their allies. And it looks here like there really hasn't been very much change. About half say that the U.S. should take account in the interests of allies, even when they disagree. And yet, again, that same dynamic, that though the overall attitudes haven't really shifted, there is growing partisan polarization, with Democrats more inclined to say cooperate with allies even if it means making compromises, and Republicans moving in the opposite direction. On another question here, you can see we've asked this question most recently in September of this year, and we hadn't asked it since the late 1990s, this question of whether other countries take unfair advantage of the U.S. And I think this finding is a little bit surprising, that actually the share of Americans who say that other countries take unfair advantage of the U.S. has declined pretty starkly since the late 1990s. Only about half of Americans say that, compared to about 7 in 10 in the late 1990s. But again, here you can see what's going on, which is that back in the 1990s, there was really very little partisan difference in these views. Republicans and Democrats equally likely to take this view that other countries don't treat the US fairly. But what we see today is even as 80% of Republicans say that just 28% of Democrats say that, which I think is pretty astounding. You can see here, again, very little change overall on what many of us who study attitudes about foreign policy and political values. This question has been asked more than 10 times in surveys going back to 1994. You can find other surveys with similar questions about whether the best approach to peace is diplomacy or military strength. Again, when you look at the top line level, about 6 in 10 say diplomacy, and that's very little changed over this period. But you can see again that same dynamic, and really that where we once saw a partisan divide of about 16 points. So it's not unusual that Democrats have long been more likely than Republicans to say that diplomacy is the path to peace. But there was only a 16 percentage point gap back in 1994. And that gap is now 50 points. And that's both the consequence of Democrats becoming more likely to say diplomacy is the way towards peace, and Republicans becoming less likely to say that and more likely to say military strength. Even when it comes to the issues that people see as, in this question, threats to the US on the international stage, and this question is from last year. Unfortunately, we have a big poll with even more questions like this, but I won't have it released until next week. So this is from last year, but the dynamics are similar. When we ask people about different major threats to the US, there are some areas of partisan agreement. By and large, last year you saw both large shares of Republicans and Democrats saying ISIS, and you can also see that North Korea's nuclear program rated high for both Republicans and Democrats. But there are key areas of disagreement. So in this question, Republicans far more likely than Democrats to view Iran's nuclear program as a major threat to the well-being of our country. And on the other side, I think a divide that, again, is likely not unfamiliar to many of you in this room. You can see that global climate change essentially ranks the absolute highest for Democrats and is the absolute lowest for Republicans when it comes to issues that are on the international stage. That also is true when you ask about climate change in a domestic context. We often see that pattern. It's a very divisive issue in terms of how important, how much of a priority it should take from the federal government. Also, not on this particular poll, but I'll also point out that when it comes to issues of immigration, illegal immigration, refugees, it's much more likely for Republicans to view those issues as threats to the U.S. than for Democrats to view that. So these are all, even when it comes to defining the terrain of foreign policy and the issues that the U.S. has to confront in terms of foreign policy, we see these partisan divides. I also wanted to take a minute and just illustrate a particular policy space, and that is trade, and to show some of the dynamics that we see around trade over the course of the past several of years. And one thing what you can see from this graphic here is that by and large, Americans have long said that free trade agreements are generally a good thing for the U.S. Now, trade has also largely not been a particularly salient issue for Americans, at least in past years. And I think we've also actually seen in some polling that it's not a top priority issue for many Americans, at least overall. But you can see here this dynamic where beginning in late 2015, throughout the 2016 election, attitudes about free trade agreements really took a negative turn overall. And then you see a bit of a rebound in early 2017 and through late 2017. And again, not surprising given what some of the things that I've talked about, that dynamic of a negative turn in free trade, attitudes about free trade really was concentrated among Republicans during the 2016 election, such that on the eve of the 2016 election, Republicans were essentially evenly divided about whether free trade agreements were good or bad for the country. You've seen that rebound somewhat, though not to pre-2016 levels among Republicans. And at the same time, while there's been less change among Democrats, during the Trump administration, we have seen a movement in a more positive direction in views of free trade agreements among Democrats. So at the end of the day, if you look back to early 2015, late 2014, there really wasn't a big partisan divide when it came to attitudes about trade. And now, since late 2015, early 2016 to today, we actually see a fairly wide partisan divide on this issue. And I will just close with a little bit of it's a little bit of a meta question here, where we ask Americans how they think the rest of the world perceives the U.S. And so this question asks whether the U.S. is more respected, less respected, or about as respected as in the past. And I think one thing that's always striking in this graphic is that Americans have long thought we were less respected by other nations than in the past. And that's actually not all that different today than it was during George W. Bush's second term, which is when we first asked this question, and Barack Obama's presidency, although you do see a slight improvement in how Americans thought the world perceived the U.S. at the very beginning of the Obama administration, but that moved negative later in his term. But here, what we also see is that how you think the world sees the U.S. is very much a function of whether the party that you support is in the White House. And so you can see that Democrats have moved to say that the U.S. views the world much more negatively now than said that during the Obama era. So about 9 in 10 Democrats now say the U.S. is less respected than in the past, up from about 50% during the Obama era, or just over 50% during the Obama era. And at the same time, you can see that among Republicans, the share saying we're less respected than in the past has really moved in the opposite direction. So one of the many dynamics at work when we talk about foreign policy, attitudes about foreign policy and how they play out in terms of actual choices that policymakers, is that it's very much informed by political perceptions of who's in power and whether they're fighting for you. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Notice we have a changing the guard in the front row.
Great. Okay, great. So I think Jocelyn set me up perfectly to take a slightly broader view about what explains why some people support and oppose different foreign policies. So Jocelyn very rightly focused on polarization, but the academic perspective has thought about a much broader range of factors that might explain, again, why some people support or oppose different foreign policies. I'm going to start by sharing with you some of the assumptions that scholars make about the US public when it comes to foreign policy. So the first assumption that you'll often see in an academic paper is that the US public is relatively uninformed about international relations and foreign policy in general. So you might remember from 2014, this was an article by some academics that got picked up in the popular media. And the idea here was basically around the time that Russia invaded Crimea, these scholars wanted to know, could Americans even identify where Ukraine was on a map? And the red dots are closer proximity to Ukraine's true location, and the blue dots are further away. I'm actually not sure what the takeaway is from this map, because I think actually the American public did pretty good here. If you just gave me a map, I would probably get close to where Ukraine was, but maybe I would get Belarus instead. But I actually think they did pretty good. But in general, this is one of the things that scholars think about the American public, is that they're relatively uninformed about international affairs. The second thing that scholars usually assume is that foreign policy is not very salient to the American public. And Jocelyn brought this up as well, that it's not as salient as compared to domestic policy issues and just other things going on in their lives. So just to give you a snapshot of this, you can look at something like a question that's asked in a lot of different public opinion surveys that ask people just to name what they think the most important problem facing the US is. I've highlighted in blue here in terms of economic problems. Foreign trade and the trade deficit was not mentioned very frequently compared to some other issues. Again, you can look at non-economic problems. Highlighted in blue here are, again, foreign policy type issues. You can see dissatisfaction with the government, unifying the country, race relations, healthcare. All of these things rate much more highly as being top of mind to Americans than most foreign policy issues, with the exception of immigration, which I think actually crosses the border, literally, between domestic and international politics, right? So, but you can see international issues, foreign policy, foreign aid, terrorism, wars, those are pretty low on people's minds. Okay, so when we establish those two assumptions, we ask ourselves then, how do people actually come to hold any opinions on foreign policy? So when Pew asks people to respond to their survey about trade, what are people using to tell them, yes, I support, or no, I oppose it? So the general consensus in the academic literature is that people use heuristics to try to answer these questions that they're relatively uninformed about and that are not very salient to them. So heuristics are just mental shortcuts that people use to come to an opinion on something. We generally categorize these into two groups. Bottom-up factors or intrinsic factors. So individuals use heuristics that are based on their personal characteristics, and I'll go into more what that means. And then top-down factors. So individuals use what key leaders say as heuristics about how they should think about a specific issue. So to go through some of these personal characteristics here, we can again break those bottom-up factors into three different groups. So the first is self-interest. If you ask me, do you support or oppose free trade, I might ask myself, how does that policy affect my personal well-being or the well-being of my family? The second thing I could ask myself is, how does this policy affect different groups in society that I care about? Maybe groups that I dislike or groups that I feel very strongly in favor of. And the third thing is, I might reflect on my own values. So I might ask myself, is this policy consistent with some value that I hold dearly? Now, all three of these could be operating at any given time. I might, have gotten a bad paycheck, so I might feel self-interest might be particularly salient to me at one point or another. But all of these factors we think may help explain why some people support or oppose a foreign policy. Additionally, other personal characteristics might matter too. So scholars recently have been starting to look at things like emotions, empathy, that sort of thing. Personality might also play a role. These aren't really heuristics, but they are intrinsic factors to individuals that might shape their beliefs about certain foreign policies. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to go into each of these three and just look at how they might help us explain some different foreign policy issues. So from some of my own work on international trade, we asked people whether they supported or opposed increasing trade with some specific countries. And then we also asked them whether they thought, how much they thought they would personally benefit from that policy and how much they thought the US economy would benefit from that foreign policy. So I'm going to show you a graph. Don't freak out. On the x-axis, the bottom there, we have the response option. So people could say, this policy doesn't affect me at all, not too much, somewhat, or very much. And on the y-axis, support for trade, you can see higher numbers correspond to more support. And the idea here is that people that don't think they're benefiting or the US economy is benefiting are much less likely to support trade than those who think they're very likely to benefit from this policy. So that right there would be a self-interested explanation for supporting international trade. Now, the problem with self-interest is that it's very difficult to activate for people, especially on foreign policy issues. Why is that? So the effect of a policy has to be clear and it has to be salient for people in order for it to engage their self-interest. terms of clarity, the costs and benefits have to be completely unambiguous, which I think if you ask me to explain the exact benefits to myself from trade with China, that might be a little bit difficult for me to do in terms of my own personal paycheck. It also has to be salient, so I just have to be aware of what those costs and benefits are, and I might not necessarily be aware. So in general, these conditions often fail for foreign policy issues. So scholars then look to different explanations, so those group explanations or those value explanations. So let's take a look at some of the things scholars have done to look at groups. Now, I myself don't study support for war, but there's been some really interesting work looking back into history about how groups have shaped support for war among the American public. So this is some data from Adam Berinsky and his study of support for American intervention into World War II. And what you can see, the three columns are dividing people in the surveys by their parents' association with allied countries, Axis countries, or whether they had US-born parents. And what you can see here is that people with US-born parents are sort of right in the middle about US intervention into World War II. Allied parents, though, much more supportive. So if you have ties to allied countries, direct ties through your family, much more supportive of intervention. But if your parents were from Axis countries, you are much less likely to support US intervention. So the idea, again, here is that my identity group, if I identified myself as a German American because my parents were born in Germany, I was much less likely to take a foreign policy position that was going to hurt a group in the world that I cared about. So we look for these kinds of group explanations for a number of different foreign policy attitudes. You can think about immigration as being another one of those big foreign policy issue areas that we think group interests are really relevant for. All right, finally, I want to talk about values, and in this case, support for foreign aid. So again, the idea here is that people want to support foreign policies that are consistent with values that they hold dearly. Now, two sets of values that I think, this is from my own work, are really important to understanding foreign aid is people's political ideology, so whether they're conservative, moderate, or liberal. And here we're thinking about conservative, moderate, and liberal, indicating people's willingness for the government to step in and help address economic deficiencies for people. On the other hand, you might think this is a foreign policy area, so people could activate their values related to internationalism or isolationism. So some of the things Jocelyn talked about, do you want the US to stay out of world politics, or do you want the US to take an active role? And what you find here is these two things are in tension for people. So for conservatives, there's no difference in their support for foreign aid. The black and the gray dots almost completely overlap, meaning they don't support foreign aid, and their conservative ideological interests overwhelm whether or not they're internationalists or isolationists. But for liberals, they're facing a bit of a struggle. They want the government to intervene to help poor people. The isolationists, however, want that help to stop at the water's edge. Okay, so their support for foreign aid is barely above that of conservatives. It's only the liberal internationalists that we see that have the highest support for foreign aid. And there's no tension for them. They want the US to take an active role, and they also want the government to step in and help people. So this is the kind of thing that we talk about when we want to explain things based on people's values. Okay, so now I want to take the top-down approach. So one of the ways we think about top-down approaches is we think about elite cues. So these are the political leaders in the world that are helping people make connections with their self-interest or their values, and also shaping public opinion in the process. And remember, US public, relatively uninformed, foreign policies relatively less salient to them, but elites can really make this more salient and help inform them. So I'm working on a project right now about American support for enforcement of international law. So John, you might be interested in this.
My ears are open.
And we looked at some of the common frames that leaders use to build public support for international law enforcement. So 2 of these common cues that we look at are, 1, emphasizing the potential for the breakdown of order. So you see this in Obama's discussion of the red line in Syria. We need to do something because if we don't, other countries will start using chemical weapons, so the breakdown of order. Or simply emphasizing the illegality of an action. So the American public may not even be aware that there's an international law against doing something, but by activating legal language, that carries moral weight for people. And so using these legal phrases can help to motivate people to support this foreign policy. And the reason this is important is because there's increasing skepticism in the United States about America's role as world police. So here all I did was Google world police and I got tons of headlines asking, should the US continue to be the world's policeman? So there's increasing skepticism. So should a leader want to pursue international law enforcement, they're going to have to build a public foundation. So we gave people some information emphasizing either breakdown or legality. And we also looked at the effects for Republicans and Democrats to see if there were different effects. So what you can see here, Republicans on the left, Democrats on the right, the higher the dot, the more support for law enforcement. And what you can see is that Democrats, the black dot corresponds to people that didn't hear any information about breakdown or law at all. Democrats only responded to the law frame. They were really compelled to support law enforcement if they were told that a country broke an international law. They were not as much moved by the breakdown framing. So this idea that if we don't do something, the whole world is going to go into chaos. And that's very consistent with some of the moral foundations that underpin Republicans and Democratic beliefs about order. And as you can see, Republicans are the reverse. They were much more responsive to the breakdown frame and actually somewhat responsive to the law frame as well. So we think this is an interesting set of results that suggest ways in which leaders can frame international law enforcement if they want to build support for that foreign policy. So I'm just going to close by telling you why I think we should care about public opinion about foreign policy. So John may correct me since he has the view from inside the government. But as scholars, we tend to think there are at least 3 reasons why we would want to care about the study of public opinion. So the first is that public opinion on foreign policy is often correlated with presidential approval. And presidential approval is important because the president needs good approval ratings in order to make policy. And because the president is seen as the most salient actor in foreign policy, how he behaves, or she, will inevitably be tied to foreign policy opinions. Now, there's also a direct accountability link as well, right? So under certain conditions, individuals may vote on foreign policy matters. And even if they don't vote on foreign policy matters, leaders may be worried that they will. And they may behave as if they're going to be thrown out of office if they don't take policy positions that are consistent with their constituents' views on foreign policy. So these are some of the reasons I think scholars have studied public opinion with great enthusiasm, and hopefully why you guys are all here to learn about it tonight. So I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Those are both great setups for what I'm going to talk about. I get to be the practitioner, and actually practitioners do sometimes have slides. I think I had so many slides, largely presented by the military when I was in the Situation Room, that I never want to see another slide. So I'm going to just talk instead, but and not too long. Peter, first, congratulations on the 30th anniversary of the school. I had the privilege this afternoon of meeting with some of your students who not only impressed me, but I honestly come away heartened because all of the students I met with said that they are still interested in going into public service, which, given the noise in Washington right now, is something that I've been concerned about. So congratulations on that. I spent 8 years, actually, as you heard, working for a Secretary of State National Security Advisor who was from California and who constantly reminded me of the nice weather out here and how she was anxious to get home to it. So I was happy to accept this invitation. I'm going to get briefly to sort of my bottom line on my perception of the role of public opinion on foreign policy making from my time in the White House, the State Department, and then give you a couple of examples. My sense from the people that I worked with is that the president and senior foreign policy makers don't pay too much attention to polls or to public opinion when it comes to foreign policy, in contrast to domestic policy. Instead, when it comes to foreign policy, they do what they think is the right thing to do based on their perception of the U.S. national interest, the information that's presented to them by their advisors, including the intelligence agencies, the State Department, and the Defense Department, and of course their own worldview. As a result, rather than following public opinion, often presidents and their national security advisors are leading public opinion. And in fact, they have an ability to change public opinion on certain issues. There's a fair amount of latitude, actually, and I'll ask Lauren to explain why, that for presidents to follow what they believe the American people want, and then ultimately to change the minds of the American people. Part of it is that they have a 4-year election cycle. It's not something that they are judged on immediately, and so the American people will really look at the results of what the policy decisions are and decide at the end of the day whether they like the results or not. I have a quote from my former colleague, Secretary of State Colin Powell, who was asked this very question in 2003 about whether the Secretary of State watches the polls. This was actually in the run-up to the Iraq War, where public opinion was running against any intervention in Iraq, and he said, "We watch the polls, of course, but we have to do what we believe is right, and we believe that if we make our case to the American people, that support can be generated." So I think when it comes to foreign policy, the senior officials, rather than looking at the polls, make a decision about what they want to do, and can ultimately, by making their case, particularly when it comes to intervention and the use of force, shape the views of the American people, who will ultimately look back and decide whether that was a successful course of action or not. So I want to give a couple of examples, starting one with the use of force. The President Bush and Obama each authorized military interventions in major cases in the Bush administration, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and with respect to President Obama in Libya, and then against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. With respect to Afghanistan after 9/11, fairly simple. After the 9/11 attacks, the president really didn't have to rally too much support after the attacks. Congress, within days, passed overwhelmingly an authorization to use military force. With respect to Iraq, harder. The president had to work hard to persuade the American people that it was really in the U.S. national interest to intervene in Iraq. Ultimately did. Congress overwhelmingly passed, you'll recall, in 2002, an authorization to use force against Saddam to compel him to comply with UN Security Council resolutions. And the president and his advisors largely did that by persuading the American people that if we let risks grow as they had in Afghanistan, that the American people would ultimately be worse off. So some in the administration, as you know, really suggesting that there was a tie between Saddam and al-Qaeda, others suggesting that it was simply conceptually the same, that if we let the dangers fester in Iraq, that it was too dangerous to be let go. But the president had to work quite hard to lead the American people, and I think in retrospect, that did not work out well for the United States. On the other hand, frankly, on my point on results, had weapons of mass destruction been found and had the war not gone as badly as it did, the views of the American people might be different. Perhaps because of the Iraq War, President Obama had a much harder time rallying support of the American people and of Congress with respect to the Libyan and Iraq-Syria war. With respect to Libya, this was really being pushed by advisors inside the Obama administration, many of whom had served in the Clinton administration and had memories of Rwanda and a feeling that the Clinton administration should have done more, pushing Obama, who was reluctant, really, even if his heart might have been in it, to intervene in Libya. And if you'll recall, as a result, it meant that the policy of the United States was not to lead, but to lead from behind. And Congress never did pass an authorization supporting the war in Libya. With respect to the Iraq-Syria war, a little bit easier to justify to the American people. Again, far away, people not interested really in intervening again, but because ISIS was committing attacks in Europe that were truly horrific, that seemed to have echoes of the threat from al-Qaeda, it was easier to rally support for the intervention in Iraq and Syria, although again, Congress refused to pass an authorization. It was an election year in 2014. Congress never did specifically authorize the use of force against Iraq and Syria, forcing the Obama administration, now the Trump administration, to rely on the authorization to use force that had been passed back in 2001 against the original al-Qaeda terrorists, with the Obama administration relying on the very strained argument that ISIS really was sharing the same DNA of al-Qaeda, because Congress would not pass a new authorization. Let me give you a couple of other examples that tie into some of the examples that we heard here. One was President Bush's decision to provide massive amounts of foreign aid to stop HIV and AIDS and malaria in Africa. The polling has consistently shown that American, and now I'm trenching on Jocelyn's territory a little bit. You should have shown up your foreign aid slide, which American people think that we give away something like 30% of the budget in foreign aid when it's closer to under 1%. Isn't that right?
Yes.
So this was something where President Bush, clearly not responding to popular support, but simply decided that because of the real devastation of HIV and AIDS and then malaria, that he would personally push Congress to support $15 billion in aid to fight HIV/AIDS, and then $1.5 billion in aid to fight malaria, something where he just pushed it on his own. And he wrote in his memoirs that in his view, America was a generous nation with a moral responsibility to relieve poverty and despair. And that was something where he just simply led the American people along. My last example is one which is probably less known to you, but which I was centrally involved in, where President Bush simply went against the will of at least a narrow segment of the American people to do the right thing. And that was to comply with a ruling of the International Court of Justice in The Hague who had ordered the United States to review the convictions and death sentences of 51 Mexican nationals, many of whom were here in California, the rest were in Texas, who had committed various rapes and murders and had been sentenced to death. But not one of them had ever been given their consular notice. When they were arrested, a treaty requires us to notify them that if they want to have a consular officer visit them, that they had a right to do so. And that was never done. Mexico sued us in the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice ordered the United States to review these. Conservatives in the United States said, don't pay any attention to this court in The Hague. You can imagine what the president's mailbag in Texas was saying. And he was the former governor of Texas. But on the recommendation of his Secretary of State, who said, we need to comply with our international law obligations, and reciprocally, we want other countries to provide consular notice to our nationals, that he decided, despite overwhelming public opposition in Texas and in California to reviewing these death sentences, issued an executive order ordering the states to review all of these. You may not know the epilogue to this story. There was a man in Texas who was the Solicitor General of Texas. His name was Ted Cruz. He sued the president. He sued the president in federal court and said, we're Texas, you can't tell us what to do. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I was on the briefs defending the president's actions to defend international law. Ted Cruz in Texas said this was illegal for the president to tell the states what to do to comply with a ruling of an international court. And sadly, I don't know how many of you know the end of the story, the president lost and Texas won. The Supreme Court in a case called Medellin said that the president doesn't actually have the power under the Constitution to interfere with state legal proceedings in that way unless Congress had specifically given him the authority. I want to end briefly with just two issues, two foreign policy areas of deep concern to me that really cry out for more presidential leadership, particularly right now. And it's particularly an area where, Jocelyn, you'll have to give me the statistics, but where we see conservative support declining. One is in support for international agreements and treaties, and the other is for the State Department and diplomacy. With respect to international treaties and agreements, we've been seeing over time less and less support for the U.S. to enter into agreements with other countries, either informal, non-treaty agreements like the Iran deal, or formal treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. There seems to be becoming a view amongst conservatives that treaties and international agreements give up American sovereignty and are unfair to the United States and possibly are even negotiated by the State Department against the interests of the American people. To give you a couple of statistics which will surprise you, even you, Peter, during the Bush administration, the Senate approved 163 treaties. That's more new treaties in that 8-year period than at any point in American history, 163 treaties. During the 8 years of the Obama administration, the Senate approved only 20 treaties. In the last 2 years in the Trump administration, the Senate has approved only 6 treaties. We are seeing tremendous decline in support for treaties and international agreements. This is an area where we really do need to have more presidential leadership. Of course, President Trump has railed both as a candidate and as president against international agreements and treaties as an infringement on American sovereignty. But it's important for our leaders to get out and explain exactly what it is that we get from different agreements. This is how we get our mail delivered. This is what allows us to fly over other countries. This is what allows us to have consular access if we're arrested in other countries. And then finally, with respect to support for the State Department, this should be fairly easy given the statistics that the American people support diplomatic action over military action. But unfortunately, over time, there has been relatively a little direct popular support for the State Department. And this surprised me, frankly, when I came into the Bush administration in 2001. I had grown up in a military family and a family of public servants, of which Foreign Service officers were always great people in my mind. And when I came into the Bush administration, I was surprised to find what this undercurrent, which is now not merely an undercurrent, but the flood, that the State Department is, and its diplomats, in fact, are not acting in the interest of the American people, that they are acting in the interest of other countries and putting the interests of other countries first, and are not achieving results for the American people. This is something that President Trump has said, and as a result, he's proposed steep cuts in the budget for the State Department, which fortunately Congress has not funded. It's remarkable how much the State Department can actually do with the small number of people that it has. Bob Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, famously said, he was off a little bit in his numbers, but that the military has more people in military bands than the Foreign Service has in diplomats serving around the world. And it's actually pretty close. There are about 6,500 people in military bands, and there are about 8,000 Foreign Service officers. The State Department achieves an enormous amount for Americans, for American business, and defending our interests around the world. And yet this is not something where we see a lot of American leadership to try to lead public opinion and persuade the American people that this is something that they really benefit from. So I guess that's why we need to send more of your students into Washington, and I am glad that they are accepting these jobs and are doing so. So I'll end with that.
Thank you very much.